In May last year, Reform UK went from a fringe party to first place in the polls off the back of barnstorming local election results that saw them wipe out every Tory council defence. This catapulted them into the bookies' favourite position to form the next government. Plenty of Tories saw the writing on the wall and jumped ship, as their former party was languishing as far down as fourth place in some polls, including some real Tory stalwarts such as Nadeem Sahawi and Suella Braverman. The most intriguing defector, however, is 2024 Tory leadership candidate Robert Jenrick, who's been appointed as Reform's Treasury spokesperson, or Shadow Chancellor as they call him. He joined Reform's leader Nigel Farage for a press conference today, which was squarely aimed at keeping another group of former Tories happy, their biggest voter demographic, which is pensioners.
Today we're setting out how we'll protect pensioners. Millions of pensioners, and in fact people in their late 50s and early 60s, are genuinely worried at the moment. They've paid in for 30 or 40 years, but they look at the debt that successive governments have racked up. They look at Labour borrowing left, right and centre, just like the Conservatives did, and they know, they fear, something's got to give. They fear this government, maybe soon led by Angela Rayner or Ed Miliband, backed up by Zach Polanski, will pull the rug from under them, will erode, chip away at the pension that they've worked and paid into for their whole life. And they're right to be worried. Well, under Reform, it will be different. We will protect pensioners. Today, I can announce that a Reform UK government will keep the triple lock for state pensions. Under Reform and Nigel Farage, your pension will always rise each year, with either inflation, average earnings, or by 2.5%, whichever of those three figures is the highest.
Amongst many things, Jenrick is completely wrong about how the state pension works. As Tory MP and GB News host Miriam Keynes pointed this out, no one has paid into the state pension. National insurance payments are spent by the government of the day, not put into a pot with your name on. Using these terms just perpetuates the myth that the state pension is a contributory scheme. It isn't. It's a non-means-tested universal benefit paid for by current taxpayers. Now, I disagree with the framing that it's being paid for by taxpayers rather than from the public purse, but broadly the point is the same. There is no specific pot with your name on it that you then access once you reach pension age because you've been paying national insurance. Just having a certain number of years of contribution means that you can access the scheme, but it's not related to how much you've paid in. In an ageing population, the state pension requires a steady stream of new taxpayers and workers to provide the productive capacity to support an ever-increasing cohort of economically inactive pensioners. But Reform UK have quite literally made their bread and butter of opposing immigration and spreading falsehoods about Britain being overpopulated. So how do they propose to support an even bigger chunk of state expenditure being subsumed by the elderly? Well, I think you can guess.
I only make the commitment today because we will cut tens and tens of billions of pounds of taxpayers' money the government wastes every year. Reform will balance the books, not just on the backs of hard-working people, in fact, never on the backs of hard-working people, never on the backs of people who've done the right thing, paid in their whole lives. We will instead fundamentally reset the priorities of government in a way that no other party has, could, or ever would. We will reset government spending so that it actually puts the British people first. We'll cut waste, and we'll cut spending they don't care for, and spending that sometimes is actually harmful to the British people, undermining our society, increasing our bills. And of course, then there's the benefits bill. 3 million more people are on out-of-work benefits than 8 years ago. We're set to spend 40 billion more on sickness benefits in 2029 than we did in 2019. The OBR says that there'll be £59 billion of net zero spending this Parliament on things like heat pumps or carbon capture and storage, spending that will only splurge if Labour win again.
Ah, yes, the mythical billions that can be cut from the welfare budget with no negative externalities that the Tories insisted upon during their calamitous austerity drive under former Chancellor George Osborne. Again, it's really worth making this point extremely clear. If you cut welfare from people who are high propensity spenders, that is worse for the economy. It's also worse broadly for the public purse, as we have seen, insofar as you get people who, if they have less money to be able to spend, they will be sicker. They'll be sicker more for a longer period of time, therefore being a longer reliance on the state, and will also be less likely to be productive in terms of being able to get a job and be able to work and contribute, rather than if you can give them a good welfare payment so that you can encourage them and be able to help them to get better to be able to work. It is worse for the macroeconomy more broadly by cutting welfare, and we have seen this broad failure over the years and years and years of Tory government since 2010, especially when you look at something like the two-child benefit cap, for example, when not only is it targeting people who cannot help themselves in children, the two-child benefit cap also ensured that people were more likely to grow up in poverty and therefore be less productive adults, and therefore mean that our economy is worse in the long run, right? To be able to ensure that we can have a growing economy and have a more productive economy, we need to ensure that people are not sick. We need to ensure that they do not go into poverty, because these things cause cyclical problems. And again, we're going to be running the same experiment and failing yet again if Reform UK are allowed to do even more austerity. Now, the biggest swindle, however, is the narrative of the ballooning benefits bill, when in reality, we have one of the most miserly welfare states in Europe. This infographic from the National Institute of Economic and Social Research shows that compared to other OECD countries, we have one of the lowest unemployment benefits, only beating out the US and Australia. And in terms of the number of people claiming health-related benefits, it is true that those have increased, but the devil is in the detail. A report from 2024 by the Institute for Fiscal Studies found that the places that saw the highest growth in claims since the pandemic were areas that already had a high number of claimants and were more economically deprived. Turns out poorer areas are sicker and more depressed. Who knew? The report also suggested that at least some of the increase can be attributed to the unique health shock that the UK suffered during the pandemic, in which Tory mismanagement saw the NHS see significantly worse health outcomes than other European healthcare systems. So again, by advocating even more austerity to fund pensioner benefits, which are literally the majority of the welfare bill, far more than we spend on disability, Reform are quite literally speedrunning the Osbornian policies that created this mess in the first place. In fact, all Jenrick's rhetoric seems lifted from Osborne, right down to the bonfire of the Quangos and cutting the green crap. And it's worth pointing out for posterity that carbon capture projects are capital investments, so they don't come out of day-to-day spending. That's not the same spending that you'd be spending on welfare for pensioners. And whilst I'm down to torch some Quangos, maybe Homes England is not the right target during a literal housing crisis, and cutting funding for heat pumps during an oil crisis also very silly. It also all falls into place when you realise Jenrick quite literally sent a copy of his first speech as Treasury spokesperson for Reform to George Osborne himself for his approval. Reform have been sliding in the polls as of late, and it's coincided pretty neatly with their move towards a boilerplate neoliberal Tory policy programme, as they've ditched their pledges on nationalisation and parked their tanks on familiar Tory turf, attack young welfare claimants to pad the social security checks for the elderly. Although there are some pensions Reform do want to cut, however.
Today, I can announce another major piece of work, a review into the long-term sustainability of continuing to permit new entrants to defined benefit pension schemes in the public sector. Such schemes were phased out in the private sector decades ago. They represent the government's second largest financial liability. The old parties almost never discuss them. But if we care about balancing the books fairly, we can't keep ducking this issue. Is it right that members of Parliament or tube drivers starting their jobs this year get a right to a gold-plated pension in 2060 or 2070, when ordinary retirees have to worry about next year? Richard Tice has already announced that a Reform government would close local government defined benefit schemes to new entrants.
It is funny to me how they're talking about the plight of pensioners, and again, perfectly reasonable to care about pensioners. Then they go, but these pensions for these people who we don't like, these public sector employees who just happen to vote for a different political party in lots and lots of cases, their pensions are bad. And the reason he pointed out is, ironically, is that, well, the private sector doesn't do defined benefit pension schemes anymore because they're a bit better than the defined contribution schemes that we have nowadays. So there still are some people getting final salary pensions today. And the argument that he makes is not, why doesn't the private sector give us a better private pensions? No. It's, let's cut the good pensions for public sector employees so we drive standards down for everybody. Shows, in fact, that Reform UK aren't really the party of alarm clock Britain. They're usually the party for landlords, the party for private equity investors, and indeed the party for pensioners. Dahlia, I want to lay out my stall here before people might misinterpret what I'm saying. I think that the triple lock should go. I think the triple lock should be replaced with pegging the state pension to wage increases, right? To average wage increases. For one very specific reason, and one other reason, which I think also ties in quite nicely too, which is that the political incentive changes when you change it to being pegged to wages, and that now everybody is incentivized and invested in a high wage society for working people. And once you get high wages for working people, those are the people who pay most taxes. Therefore, that goes into the amount of contribution to ensure that we can be able to afford continual pensions moving forward, right? And it's worth pointing out, ending the triple lock is not making pensioners worse off. It just means that the pension doesn't rise as quickly more broadly. Like, we took a decision as a country that we weren't going to be fully funding of the pension scheme more broadly, like other countries have done that have better pensions than we do from the state. And we focused more on encouraging people to get private pensions, which is why there's usual kind of automatic enrolment in private pensions in this country, and that we have pension credit and the state pension as like a baseline which people can build on top of from there. So I think that whilst we should be getting better pensions from the private sector to ensure that we get buy-in from everybody and we don't just continually have state expenditure continually go towards pensioners, because whilst the welfare bill has remained broadly about 20% of GDP, the percentage of that goes to pensioners very specifically is continually rising. And what's going to working age people who have less access to owning their own home, who are having worse wages, and broadly in terms of the economic conditions they were brought up in, significantly worse than current retirees who grew up in kind of the economic boom and like under the biggest bull market in history in the 90s and the 2000s, which, you know, working people today never had access to. And it's a way of being able to make intergenerational unfairness a little bit fairer. What's your opinion on this? I don't know whether you agree or not.
Look, when it comes to the triple lock, I think, and there's two separate kind of conversations to have here. One is about the actual specificity of the triple lock and removing it as a policy. I think for me, I just have an overall attitude of like, so long as we haven't actually introduced a good, appropriate, proportionate wealth tax, asset tax, corporation tax, I don't think we need to be going after any elements of the welfare state. And I think I in fact would like to see other elements of the welfare state brought more in line with the way that pensions are run than the other way around, which is where my hesitancy with being in support of ending the triple lock goes. I think we should actually be trying to get more of the welfare state in the direction of how pensions are currently organised versus changing the pension system so that it is more like the rest of the welfare state. But honestly, I just think until we have a proper wealth tax, a proper asset tax, a proper corporation tax, we don't even need to be having this conversation, because we haven't actually gone after the primary circuits of wealth that are currently being siphoned out of this country and out of the state where it should be, so that we can actually live in a decent welfare, with decent welfare and with decent infrastructure. I do understand the sort of frustration that older people seem to continually vote against funding the welfare state that they have always benefited from and that they continue to benefit from, whether it's, historically for the fact that, when they were our age, they had a much more functioning NHS, they had really good social housing, they had half decent comprehensive and state education. And, we don't have any of those things. And now they continue to be the highest beneficiaries of the welfare state. I understand that creates a lot of frustration. But I do think that this announcement by Reform, and Robert Jenrick coming out and saying these things, and Nigel Farage also said something a few days ago where he said, older people in society who, unlike the younger generation, have worked hard and paid into the system, should have their pensions protected. I think that was ultimately the main purpose or the main priority of reform in hitching themselves onto this policy. That press conference was not about, announcing an economically sound vision for the country. It was purely about playing a divisive politics to create a culture war that can create particular clusters of the voting public. So instead of people being able to form, somewhat maybe unpredictable coalitions around, different policy perspectives or whatever, instead people are forming political identities and convictions along generational lines. And obviously, if that happens, someone like, Reform is going to go after the older vote because, first of all, they actually aren't interested in winning a majority of people. They aren't interested in building a broad-based coalition across lots of different demographics. They are interested in looking at who are the current most prolific voters already in the political system, and how do we lock them in? The way we lock them in is we create a culture war that solidifies them as a demographic and then allows us to put ourselves as the party that represents them. So it's a purely political announcement. It is nothing to do with economics. It's not economically sound to be cutting wealth for all the reasons you've outlined, Helena, to cut the rest of the welfare state in order to uphold the triple lock. It creates a sick society. It creates an unwell society. It's not even good for pensioners, because if you don't have a supported younger generation, if you don't have people, able to get decent jobs in, for example, the care sector, there's going to be no one to look after people in their older age. So this is purely about creating a culture war, which, as the Reform is an expert in now, is creating culture wars that bring into being a particular group as an identity that is based around resentment and the belief that, there is someone out there taking something that's yours, and that person is undeserving, that person is lazy, that person is different from you, and we're going to strengthen your cohesion as a demographic that we can predictably capture by focusing and creating these different outsiders. And whether that's immigrants or whether that's, as a pensioner, your own grandchildren. Because this is why I don't understand why this form of politics is so effective. Because it must be effective for Reform to be banging that drum so hard. They will have access to kind of voting data and political data and whatever that I don't have access to. But I always think, how are we so effective in getting a significant chunk of the older generation to vote against the interests of their own grandchildren or their own children? When I think about older people in my life, their politics has actually moved towards the left in many instances. And I'm not just going to say that that's my influence, but what they have seen is this sense of I was able to, work as a school teacher or work as a nurse or work a normal job. And I was able to buy a home that was relatively near where my parents lived, that was relatively near where I grew up, where I could have a network of people supporting me when I had a young family. And, my child, or my grandchild more who is more educated than I was, who has done all the work experience, done all this, that and the other, is unable to even get a job in a cafe, and so that kind of understanding that my child or my grandchild, who I worked so hard to have them have a better life than me, they have a significantly worse life than me. And that has actually radicalized a lot of older people in my life towards the left, who have said, oh, clearly there's a structural support that I had that they didn't have. But it seems that on a macro scale, at least Reform have made the calculation that people can be turned against one another in their own families, which is sad.
I will say I do think that I have seen quite a lot of this coming from a certain sector of the boomer population, not
Maybe.
all, before anyone leaves any angry comments, that are, in some cases, quite entitled. I have seen a lot of boomer entitlement broadly in terms of, well, I worked hard, therefore I deserve to have this pension. I'm well, we are all working hard.
Yeah.
This idea that I see so often and I hear so often is that young people are frivolous with their money, which is actually categorically untrue in terms of overall consumptive expenditure. Young people, Zoomers and millennials, have had less to be able to spend on consumption than the generations that preceded them, again, because of the economic conditions of the 90s and the 2000s, and the economic conditions have just been significantly worse. It's just a total canard to disregard the interests of young people that I hear very, very frequently. And I do think that there is a lot of resentment too, like reform coming out against working from home, and I just see so many people agreeing with their position here. And again, there is no material incentive, unless you force there to be through state policy, to get people who do not work to necessarily care about people who do work without them engaging in some level of empathy with which to do that, right? And right-wingers, conservatives, seemingly don't have much empathy when it comes to that fact. When it comes to the voter base of reform, it's mostly older people who are pensioners who don't work. It's mostly most of the politicians are like landlords and bankers. Landlords don't do any work, and bankers don't exactly work particularly hard. And they're funded by people who make all of their money off of dividends and off of kind of crypto investment, who also don't do any work either. Why should they care about the conditions of working people, right?
Yeah, I mean, maybe I'm speaking from a urban or London perspective, because I think one thing about London that's maybe different to a lot of the rest of the country or major urban centres is that, young and old, we live in much more mixed demographic communities where old and young kind of live together a lot more, whereas in a lot of other parts of the country you have this young flight where people have left. And so maybe it's just an idiosyncratic thing where it's I've just come into contact with more open-minded boomers. But I do find that it is kind of I do feel a lot of sadness at the fact that it seems to be such an effective radicalizing point to make people who have had, who lived in the golden age of state support and who lived, and I'm not going to say that every day was amazing or that, there wasn't poverty or there wasn't inequality, but compared to what we have now, it's just it's night and day. And it's for people who were able to build decent lives off the back of that system to then be cutting the legs off of that system, it's very, very sad. But I do think it is a position that they are being actively groomed into, the people who do fall down that rabbit hole by the media, by, the likes of Farage, who understand that sometimes resentment is the most valuable political currency. And, maybe we should be, cultivating that a little bit more, but in the right direction, i.e. to, corporations and the super wealthy.
I mean, I think that's probably 100% true. I would definitely agree with you there. I don't want to start a generational war. I want to ensure that we fix the system so those wars don't happen. Another quick reminder to have your say in the Novara Media Audience Survey. It's live now, and we really do want to hear from you. I genuinely mean it when I say your feedback matters. We're about to take our biggest leap yet, and understanding who's watching helps us get it right. And don't forget that if you fill it in by 11:59 p.m. on Sunday the 12th of April, you'll be in with a chance of winning up to 1 in 5 £50 vouchers to spend in the merch shop. Just hit the link in the description or head to novara.media/survey to share your thoughts.